I was getting ready to go to the airport, just thinking about what I had to do, because John was arriving back in the afternoon. And the phone went, and it was John's boss at work, saying that John had been kidnapped. And I was really shocked, first of all, to be called at home like that. And couldn't really think why he'd called, and then when he said John had been kidnapped, I just couldn't take it in. It just seemed so unreal, because I thought he must be on the plane to come home. That's where he should have been at that time. That there must have been some mistake. They must have thought it was John and it wasn't. Or that they just got the wrong person and they'd realise in a couple of hours and let him go. But some people have called him lovable rogue. He's very lovable, and he can be a real rogue at times, quite a lot of the time. But John's the most generous person I've ever met, and I think everybody who knows him always has a good time with him. He's incredibly charming, just a really, really nice person who it's very easy to love, and he doesn't deserve all this.
يلا كيف ما تطلع اطلع.
Well, you know, you'd better get a move on because it's now 12 o'clock your time. Your flight leaves in half an hour. He said, don't worry, I just want to give you these details. I just said to him, in a joking way, be careful of the airport road, because I'd been in Beirut the year before for the hijacking of the TWA airliner, and I said it can be a dangerous place. And he said, don't worry, all the cars are waiting. And I said, all right, off you go. And he said, I'll see you at 5:30 in the local office pub.
The airport to fly home, having spent only 5 weeks in your country. I find it very difficult to understand why he has been held for so long, and so once again I am making an appeal to those who are holding him to release him and let him return to his family. We would appreciate it if you could let us have some news of John regarding his health and well-being. Could you please now come forward and say who you are and for what purpose you are holding him?
Up you go then. Back to church.
John McCarthy, along with all the others, I know John's father, and I know his girlfriend in London, and they can all be assured that we are working hard, and we are not dismayed at all.
Terry Wake was the only person who was doing anything for the hostages. He was working mainly for the Americans, but He was the only one who was actually going into Beirut and talking to people connected with the kidnappers. And he seemed to have had some success, because before Iran Gate was revealed, he'd got a couple of people out. Nobody really knew why, but it looked like Terry Waite had succeeded. So I went to see him a couple of times, and he told me he'd do everything he could for John. And I trusted him, because he was very straightforward and very sincere, I thought, and he seemed to care about John and the other hostages. So I put a lot of faith in what he could do. And when he was kidnapped, it was a really awful time, because there was nobody else left to work for John and the others. Most of the stuff going out is going to go out in bulk, though.
From all the parties to add them to it. Kennedy's was going to start end it if we want to.
And the contrast between the British and the French hostages, etc.
When we started at the end of last year, we sat down and tried to work out a slogan for the campaign. And one we came up with was, "Don't forget the British hostages in Beirut," because it did seem that there was a grave possibility that people would forget that 3 Britons were being held hostage there, and that it wasn't a question of people not caring. They'd simply forgotten that people were out there. So we launched the campaign just to kind of bang home the thought that every day that you and I go about our normal business, there are 3 people sitting in a darkened room in Beirut who ought to be home.
Oh, we've got to learn the truth. You're not alone. It's John, we want you home. You're not alone. John, we want you home. You're not alone. And the stars in the sky don't mean nothing to you. They're a mirror.
It remains the British government's responsibility to get the Britons back home. And quite how they choose to do it, or how they choose not to do it, remains up to them. What I think we're trying to drive home to them is that they've got to do something. They've got to accept that it's down to them to bring our friends and our fellow citizens home. And quite how they do it is very much up to them.
Toujours en langue de bois, voilà, un langage.
Going back to April 1786, tell us what went on that day.
I was getting ready to go to the airport, just thinking about what I had to do, because John was arriving back in the afternoon. And the phone went, and it was John's boss at work, saying that John had been kidnapped. And I was really shocked, first of all, to be called at home like that. It couldn't really think why he'd called, and then he said John had been kidnapped. Just couldn't take it in. It just seemed so unreal, because I thought he must be on the plane to come home. That's where he should have been at that time. That there must have been some mistake. They must have thought it was John, and it wasn't. Or that they'd just got the wrong person and they'd realised in a couple of hours and let him go. So I had to take a photograph into work to put on the lunchtime news. And then a couple of weeks later, when I did go back to work, after all the fuss had died down, it was really quite strange to see everybody at work. They were still quite shocked at what had happened to John. Nobody had forgotten him, but they'd all got used to it. They could all put it to the back of their minds and get on with their jobs, and I couldn't understand how they could do that. I thought we should all be stopping work and insisting that something happened to get John back. We shouldn't just carry on as if it was normal, because it obviously wasn't. John was being kidnapped for two or 3 weeks. So that just seemed terrible.
Did it ever occur to you at that time, when it happened in the days afterwards, that you might be in for a wait of 2.5 years?
No. I never thought that at all. Well, after 6 weeks, I thought that was a hell of a long time, 6 weeks. I marked it in my diary. And I think then we were thinking, can't even imagine 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. Can't imagine it getting that long. And then on the first anniversary of John being kidnapped, I realised myself that if it could go on for 1 year, then it could go on for 2 or 3. Couldn't really imagine reaching 2 years, but after we'd reached 1, then there's every possibility that we'd reach 2.
How do you think he's going to cope with it, or how he has coped with the imprisonment?
I don't know. I have faith in John's personality and his character, because John can get on well with anybody, and most people within a few minutes of meeting John really like him, and that impression remains with them. The more they get to know him, they like him more. So I think the people who are with him, if he has any contact with them, he'll get on well with them, and he'll have the best possible treatment that you could have. But I don't think anybody can really predict what 2.5 years of captivity does to somebody. I think he's got to be changed in some way, even if it's just that he's become more reflective about everything. And physically, I think he's quite strong physically, John, but just 2.5 years of not having any medical treatment, no dental treatment, bad food, no sunlight, all that's going to take its toll on him. But then again, he's young, and everybody who's come out of captivity after 3 years or so, they recover really quickly, or they seem to. So I just hope that John will be the same.
For people who haven't met him, what's he like?
Some people have called him lovable rogue. He's very lovable, and he can be a real rogue at times, quite a lot of the time. But John's the most generous person I've ever met, and I think everybody who knows him always has a good time with him. He's incredibly charming, just a really, really nice person who it's very easy to love, and he doesn't deserve all this.
You're saying that obviously he will have changed in this period of captivity. I mean, no one can stay the same, but what's happened to you in that time?
I think I've just got more cynical. I've had to, what was probably quite a good thing really, probably quite naive before all this happened. But I think I've just learnt a lot about people and about the way governments work and about politics and things that I didn't really realise before. I got more reflective as well. When something like this happens, you start realising what's important to you.
In some sense, is it, you know, the first serious thing that's happened in your life?
It's the biggest thing that's happened to me, yeah. The one that's had the most impact on me, yeah.
Aside from being more cynical and more distrustful of governments and authority, what about the reaction of individual people? Has that impressed you or not?
Yeah, well, on the most part, I've been really amazed at how supportive some people have been. The people that sometimes that you'd least expect it of, have been great. They've just been amazing. I don't know if I could have been as generous to them if they were in my position. People I don't even know have been really supportive. All the letters we're getting and everything. John's close friends have been really good. And then sometimes other people that you'd think would help practically with everything and be more concerned haven't been, and that it's been a sort of strange learning process about people. You can't ever predict how people are going to react to something like this.
Good. Thank you. Did you think he was going to be in danger when you went to Beirut?
Not particularly, no. It seems really naive now, but I didn't really think that he was going to be in danger of being kidnapped. There are all the usual dangers of bombings and things like that, but not any particular danger of being kidnapped. I don't think he did it either. He wanted to stay on an extra week to finish his work when he was told to come home. He didn't think that he was in any particular danger, and the people in the office told him he wasn't. So it didn't seem to make sense when he had been kidnapped.
Looking back now, sort of just about 2.5 years later to that day, now since then, when you've organised a full-scale campaign, you've met government ministers, you've been abroad, you've held press conferences, rallies, and all the rest of it. Looking back now, does the reaction at the time seem amazingly naive?
Oh, yes. I can't believe that, first of all, I let John go off to Beirut in the first place. Secondly, that I was shocked when he was kidnapped. Should have expected it, really, after the bombing of Libya. And thirdly, that we thought it was all going to be over in a couple of days. I don't think anybody could really believe that John was going to be held that long. We all thought he'd be back in a few days or a week when they realised that they'd got the wrong person, and when they realised that this was John they were dealing with, and that we were all waiting for him back in London, so they just let him go. Everybody was saying, oh, they're bound to let him go when they realised that he's only John McCarthy. So it just seems amazingly naive that we didn't realise fully what had happened for a long time.
For that sort of first 9 months or so, before Terry Waite was himself kidnapped, he seemed to be about the only person doing it, but trying to get hostages out at all. What were you doing for Terry Waite, and what were you hoping for from him?
Well, Terry Waite was the only person who was doing anything for the hostages. He was working mainly for the Americans, but he was the only one who was actually going into Beirut and talking to people connected with the kidnappers. And he seemed to have had some success, because before Iran Gate was revealed, he'd got a couple of people out. Nobody really knew why, but it looked like Terry Waite had succeeded. So I went to see him a couple of times, and he told me he'd do everything he could for John. And I trusted him. He was very straightforward and very sincere, I thought, and he seemed to care about John and the other hostages. So I put a lot of faith in what he could do. Looking back, that again seems a bit naive to think that he could help British hostages when Iran Gate came out, because it was all to do with dealing, it seems. so I don't really know how he could have helped John, but at the time it seemed like he was the only one who could help us. And when he was kidnapped, it was a really awful time, because there was nobody else left to work for John and the others.
Was there kind of growing sense of this period that whereas people were talking about humanitarian appeals for people's release and that the goodness would overcome, was there kind of growing sense that actually it's going to be a lot more sort of brass and money on the table and improve relations, or it was going to take some kind of deal?
Yeah, I think it took a while though for us to realise that, didn't he? It took a really long time, because it wasn't until 87, early 87, that Iran Gate came out, and that everyone began to see what the French were doing to get their hostages out. It was all through 1987 there's a growing feeling that it wasn't as simple as it looked, and people weren't just being released because the kidnappers felt in a good mood or whatever. There was a feeling that it took an awful lot of negotiations and a long period of talks and discussions and negotiations to get anybody out at all, and that hadn't even begun for John in 1987, that process. Nothing was happening on him, so when I began to realise that it took a couple of years to negotiate the release of somebody, it looked like John could be in there for a long, long time.
During that period, that sort of first year and a half before the campaign kicked off properly, you went abroad a couple of times, you went out to the Middle East. Tell me about that trip and about what you were doing and what you were hoping.
The trip to Syria and Cyprus was really to just raise John's profile, his case, with anybody and everybody. We didn't really have a lot of expectations from it, although I think secretly we hoped that we'd come back with some really good news. But because nobody seemed to be talking to anybody, nobody seemed to be raising John's name with anybody. That's what people in Beirut were telling us. John wasn't talked about. That was the main thing that we wanted to do, to take photographs of him and tell people about him and see if they could find out anything. And we talked to a lot of people, that's Nick and I, talked to a lot of people in Damascus, faction leaders from Beirut. And although they didn't have any information about John, we gave them photographs of him, all his details, and they promised to pass them round amongst their people. And they all thought that John was alive. They didn't have any evidence, but they all said in their opinion he was, and that was a huge step forward at the time. Huge, because we didn't have a clue whether John was dead or alive. And for them to believe that he was a huge step forward.
It's true, because the time he was taken to, almost certainly 3 Britons were killed in the aftermath of the raid on Libya. And in the end, you didn't get any sort of positive evidence that John was alive till April of this year. How did you keep going with your belief that John was still alive?
I think it was just a faith in his ability to survive, I think. I just couldn't... It didn't seem possible to me that he was dead. I believed that he was alive. I felt that he was alive, and I just thought... I just trusted him to be able to get through it and to survive it. And also, I worked it out just logically that if John had been killed, we'd have heard about it, and that on that trip to Syria somebody would have said to us that we don't know, but we think he's dead. Nobody said that at all. Nobody's ever said that, apart from some people in Britain who didn't really know much about the case, just assumed he'd been killed at that time, the bombing of Libya, but they didn't know. So everything seemed to point to the fact that he was alive.
At the end of the last year, and beginning of this year, you kicked off the campaign properly. You decided to ignore the Foreign Office and go for big publicity. Why did you do that?
Because we were coming up to John's 2-year anniversary of being taken there was still no news of him. We didn't really know if he was dead or alive. Foreign Office couldn't tell us. And all the conversations I had with them didn't give me any confidence at all that we were ever going to find out that he was either dead or alive, or that they were going to begin some process that would bring about his release. And by that time it became obvious that they had to be talking to a lot of people to be able to say that they were making any progress towards John being released, and they weren't doing that. Their policy was to do nothing, because that was in line with British government policy, and they said that they believed it was the best thing. But after 20 months of that policy not working, there wasn't any alternative but to disagree with them and to try and bring people's attention to the fact that John had been missing for so long and nothing was being done to get him out.
Okay.
Chris, why do you think there was a need to have the Friends of John McCarthy?
Well, when we started out at the end of last year, we decided we had to campaign strongly because... Take two. When we started at the end of last year, we sat down and tried to work out a slogan for the campaign, and one we came up with was "Don't forget the British hostages in Beirut," because it did seem that there was a grave possibility that people would forget that 3 Britons were being held hostage there, and that it wasn't a question of people not caring. They'd simply forgotten that people were out there. So we launched the campaign just to kind of bang home the thought that every day that you and I go about our normal business, there are 3 people sitting in a darkened room in Beirut who ought to be home, who ought to be got back. And the government should be doing what they can to get them back. There was no real sense of seriousness from the government, or certainly no sense of urgency about getting the Britons back. And in the end, we decided that we had to campaign loudly and publicly, and ask citizens, ask MPs, ask the government, what are you doing? How are you going to get them back?
And what did you want the government to do?
Well, it's largely up to the government to decide itself what it wants to do. We've always taken a decision, though, that it's not for us to dictate policy to the government, and that they can do anything they feel like to get them back, just so long as they do get them back. But I think it's fair to say we were pretty disgruntled that they weren't talking to the Iranian government about the hostages, since Iran appeared to hold the key, and they weren't talking to the Syrians. They weren't really talking to anyone about the fate of 3 Britons being held abroad. So at least if you establish that dialogue, you've got a chance of getting somewhere. And it's never going to be a question of sending a planeload of arms to Tehran in exchange for people, or buying them out. But you've got to do something. I mean, the government admits that, at least they say that anything short of an outright deal is okay by them. That's all we want them to do.
What do you say to people who say that the British government's way of handling this is the right one, as opposed to the way the French, the Germans and the Americans have got their people out?
Well, the British government has taken a decision from the start that they won't do anything that resembles a deal to get the Britons back. And we've never challenged that. We've never argued against that. We've never said they should do a deal. We've always said, okay, fine, you can decide you're not going to do a deal, but then how are you going to get them out? Because it remains the British government's responsibility to get the Britons back home. And quite how they choose to do it, or how they choose not to do it, remains up to them. What I think we're trying to drive home to them is that they've got to do something. They've got to accept that it's down to them to bring our friends and our fellow citizens home. And quite how they do it is very much up to them.
And what are you asking ordinary people to do?
To write to their MPs, to write to the government, to pray, to put up posters, just not to forget, just to... One would hope that it could become like, if not quite like France, and something like that, where it became a topic of conversation in the street, or it became a matter of individual concern that fellow citizens were being held hostage, and that something must be done to bring them back. And it's, I think what we're asking individuals to do is not only not forget, but just to keep talking about it, stay concerned.
And now that the government's holding talks with Iran on all kinds of issues, do you think that the hostages are an important item on their agenda?
I would hope so. I mean, the government tells us that they can talk about trade deals, they can talk about diplomatic relations, they can talk about reparations to damaged embassies, but it would be quite wrong to talk about hostages. Well, I don't see that. I think they should be talking about hostages. I think individual lives matter an awful lot. And they ought to be talking about them. I hope they are. And I would hope that the fate of the 3 British hostages would be seen as an obstacle to restoring full diplomatic relations. If they're not an obstacle, I think they should be.